Welcome back, Mike G. The first episode, you laid the groundwork of glitter and glam in the 60s. Now tell us all about how it exploded in the 70s.
Well, thanks. By the way, it's really great to be here again. By the way, for those of you out in YouTube land, please check out downpeppertreelane.com for a great compendium. It's a hub of all things mellow nostalgic is kind of the word I like to use for it. Okay, so what we're here to talk about now is the glitter and glam scene in both the UK and the United States. And I've thought about this quite a bit, and I'm going to tell you something that's a little strange, and a lot of Americans wouldn't get this. But one of the very first influences on the glitter and glam scene in the UK was that television show Doctor Who. And you'd be like, what? Well, you know, most Americans don't watch Doctor Who. I do. When its pacing is different than American sci-fi like Star Trek, so it's a little hard to get through them. But the reason I say that that's an influence is because the title sequence from the very beginning had, as far as back as 1961, had a rhythmic pattern in it that seemed to be ingrained in the British psyche from then on, and it went kind of like this. And then of course there's the synthesizer or the theremin on top of anyway, but that's not the point. It was that weird rhythm, and every Doctor Who theme from then on up until maybe in the 90s or something retained that and did different versions of it. So that reemerged in some of the rhythmic sequences of some of the very early glitter and glam bands. Most noticeably a band called Ambrose Slade, which was later just called Slade. Slade was a band that was very, very hugely a part of the British psyche, but never really broke here. They were probably a little too British.
Maybe Chameleon, maybe one song.
Yeah, they did finally get a little airplay in the 80s here, but the only thing that people know about Slade here is the fact that that band Quiet Riot covered two of their songs.
Yeah.
But they were an older band. They actually, see, here's the thing. A lot of these bands that became glitter and glam bands started in the very late 60s, and I don't think they really knew what they wanted to do. They knew they wanted to do something, but they didn't have a clear idea on the direction yet. And certain things kind of happened and coalesced that made it clearer. And when one band would have a hit with something, it inspired the other bands. So another big influence on glitter and glam music was, as I talked about in the last video, the freak beat scene. And one of the best bands, I think one of the best examples of how freak beat expressed itself as a pop form was a band, again, not too well known in the United States, called The Move. And I really love The Move. And one of my favorite songs by them is Fire Brigade. But The Move was an interesting band because they took the psychedelic thing a little bit of a step further. They injected it with a lot of instrumentation from classical music. They had a lot of cello and a lot of strings and horns and unusual things like that.
Was that Jeff Lynne?
It became Jeff Lynne.
Okay.
Jeff Lynne was not an original member of The Move, but he joined later on.
Okay.
Jeff Lynne had his similar thing going on with a band called the Idle Race, excuse me. And they were more silly psychedelic of the ilk of like Sgt. Pepper's. But when he joined The Move, it started to become something else happened there. And basically there was a guy, The Move was cool. Let me come back to this. The Move was cool because The Move wore very elaborate costumes on stage and had long hair, and they were really visually the freak beat thing to a T. And there was a creative force in the band called Roy Wood was his name. And something happened with The Move I don't know. They were some accidents with drugs, believe it or not. Some of the guys in the Move got dosed with very large doses of LSD at a concert once, and that was the end of it. And so the Move kind of temporarily broke up in the '68, and that's when Jeff Lynne came into the picture. So at the very late '60s, the Move was a three-piece. It was Jeff Lynne, Roy Wood, and Bev Bevan, who ended up being the drummer for ELO. And the Move, those three guys put out an album, and then they said, you know what, we don't have to be the Move. I mean, times are changing. Why don't we do something else? So they came up with this concept called Electric Light Orchestra. And because it gave them the opportunity to do more of this classically infused music that they wanted to do. And so they put out one album, and then the record company said to them, mates, you still have one more contract, still have one more album to do as the Move. So they had to go back in the studio and do one more Move album.
I see.
And then they broke up. Then the Move broke up for good. And that album gave us Do Ya, which ended up being redone by ELO later on.
It's a great song.
Yeah. So anyway, but this is not where this pertains to the glitter and glam movement is this. After the Move broke up, so did ELO in a sense. Roy Wood said, look, you guys, I'm just going to go do my own thing. So Jeff Lynne carried on with ELO instead. And so he did more of this orchestral thing. He hired all these orchestral musicians that eventually became ELO, and did a second album. They did Roll Over Beethoven and all that.
Were they addressing glam?
They weren't so much, but the guy that was Roy Wood.
Okay.
Roy Wood started a new band called Wizzard, Wizzard, and kind of abandoned all the classical stuff. And he wore crazy makeup, like white clown makeup with all these red and blue blotches and zigzags and all this weird stuff. And he really got freaky. But the music, strangely enough, was not classical in that sense. It was very pop, and it was different kind of a pop, though. So Wizzard was like one of the very first glam bands in that sense.
Let me give you another one. Mott the Hoople?
Okay, sure. Mott the Hoople, another very seminal band, because they started out as more of a traditional rock and roll band, too, in the late 60s. Their first album came out in '68, and Mott the Hoople is the name of a book that was written by a circus freak named Mott the Hoople. So that's where
now we know.
From. Yeah, so
who knew?
I know, and that's telling, and that's actually very, very appropriate, because their writing was already kind of sassy. It had some of the sassiness of the glam movement. But basically what happened was David Bowie, who I'm jumping ahead, but David Bowie, when he got into his glam scene, wrote this song for them called All the Young Dudes.
Which was a hit in the U.S.
Yes.
For sure.
Yeah, and so that's where people might know Mott the Hoople from.
Okay.
Now, so if we're going to talk about Mott the Hoople, then we have to talk about David Bowie again. Now, David Bowie got his start in the late 60s, too, and he was sort of a man without a country for a while musically, until he got the idea to do something based on space. And so he came up with this idea for Space Oddity. And it was a huge monster hit on both sides.
We were going to the moon in '69.
Exactly. Oh, that's true. That's right.
Okay.
So it was a good tie-in. So, Bowie was always kind of an opportunist. And that was a perfect tie-in for the vibe of the time. And he, and of course he made the parallel between being out in space and being strung out on drugs and things like that. But later on, Bowie was the first guy to inject the freaky element into glam and glitter. He was, of course, I think bisexual, would be safe to say. So he brought that element into it. He also brought elements of the occult and elements of a fascination with death. The earmark of not so much glitter rock, but of glam rock was this freakiness, this obsession with death, obsession with drugs, obsession with sex, sexual ambiguity. That seemed to be a big part of it. So there was an element of shock rock in it as well. Glitter, now you might wonder, what is the difference between glitter and glam rock? Well, there is a difference. Going back to Slade, it was that musically it tended to be that music with that same rhythmic sequence in it. It tended to all have that sort of dun 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 kind of a thing. And another thing that was an earmark of music at the time was that when they would perform live, they started putting the drums in the middle of the stage instead of in the back. And then kind of building everybody in a circle around them. And that was kind of a clever idea because glam and glitter rock, mostly glitter rock, was really about the drums. It was about that pounding drum beat. And the guy that really came along and did it to a T, which is why it bears his name, is Gary Glitter. So Gary Glitter had an album, he had a song called Rock and Roll Part 1 and Rock and Roll Part 2. And that actually also reminds me of something that I'd forgotten to mention, is that another earmark, see, glitter and glam was a swirl of all kinds of influences. And another earmark of glam was a trend that was popular in the 70s of sort of a retro thing back to the music of the 50s. So a lot of bands in the early 70s were trying to sound like 50s rock, but corned up, kitsched up, more updated. It wasn't as strict an interpretation, but there was a romanticization of the 50s, like James Dean and that sort of thing. Like you heard David Essex talking about, see him move on the movie screen, Jimmy Dean, James Dean, and that was very much indicative of that sort of retro thing. And Gary Glitter had a lot of that in his music.
It had a groove.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And,
well, can I take it to New York for a minute?
Oh, absolutely.
Ground Zero, New York Dolls.
Okay, sure. And, okay, so that's all what was going on in England. Now, in America, New York was a big melting pot of a lot of this stuff, too. You had this weird band called the New York Dolls, and they were a bunch of drugged up guys that would raid thrift stores and just grab whatever kind of weird clothes they could find, mostly women's blouses and a lot of weird things. And they would wear lipstick. And in 72, they put out a series of demos and then finally got signed. They were very rough sounding. They were not as smooth musically as the stuff that was going on in England. They had a very rough, raw sound.
Not much radio airplay, right?
No, but you could hear potential in it. You could hear that there was, given a little more polish and better production, they really would have had something.
They could have been.
They could have been.
They were a contender. Okay.
But this is why a lot of the punk bands in the later 70s cited them as an influence, is because they were outrageous and that their sound was raucous enough to be an influence on perhaps bands like Blondie and the Ramones, and so there was definitely that. And then you had another bunch of guys from New York that had a little different idea. They wanted to do this band. It's called Wicked Lester, and it was kind of about New York urban life, kind of some of the aspects of it. But what they realized is that they put out one album and they thought, well, what's wrong with this is it's too slow, it's too orchestrated, it's too progressive. We want to get to the meat of it. We want to get to a stripped down rock and roll thing. So they retooled the idea, and then they got the idea to put on black outfits and white makeup and rebranded themselves as Kiss. And Kiss didn't do too well in the beginning. Their first couple albums didn't do that well.
And kind of wore glam outfits at first.
Oh,
right?
They were absolutely glam. Yeah, they were definitely. They definitely gave Roy Wood a run for his money, and were probably influenced by what Roy Wood was doing.
Sure.
But where Kiss finally hit the mainstream was they put out an album of them playing live called Kiss Alive. And that was when people realized that what you're really getting with Kiss is a great live show. The songs themselves are all right, but it's the live show that really...
Energy.
Yeah. I mean, Gene Simmons with his fire breathing and Paul Stanley with his outrageous, kind of sexually ambivalent, stage presence, and the other two guys, and the spaceman and the Catman and all this lore that went behind it.
It exploded.
Yeah, they were fantastic. So,
but I have to jump back to England right now because tell me about the moment David Bowie gets the red haircut. Is that a bunch of pent-up sexuality? Has bisexual issues ever been dealt with before? And tell me about Ziggy Stardust.
No.
Tell me about that moment.
Yes, and that was, in my opinion, some of his best work. That really was... He was working with T-Rex, actually, and I think I forgot to mention.
We have to mention.
Yeah, T-Rex was critical. T-Rex is considered the first guy to do a glam performance on top of the Pops because he did a performance of a song called Hot Love with glitter under his eyes. And that's all the writers say, okay, that was the first glitter rock performance on TV, or glam rock. I guess there was enough of these groups were starting to think in a similar form of thinking to the point where Bowie just somehow...
He captured it?
Yeah, he just finally looked within. And see, Bowie's whole thing was, Bowie was a chameleon in the sense that he wasn't ever the same person from month to month. He would change. And Ziggy Stardust was an alternate persona that he had invented. And it was based on someone in the 50s. It was somebody who didn't quite make it, from what I read, and somebody that nobody would know about, but he used that as the basis of the story. But basically, yeah, he just came up with this incredible set of music that ended up being called, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders of Mars. Is there life on Mars? John, I'm Only Dancing. And just these great things.
But hasn't flamboyance been a part of rock ever since? Hasn't there been kind of a gay influence in a way?
Well, I mean, I think it could have tapped back a little bit to Little Richard, but yeah, the whole point was it was time to get your freak on.
Okay.
The 70s was about anything shocking, whether it be sexuality, whether it be an obsession with death, whether it be drugs or loose morals or what have you. And yet, the odd thing is it blended with something very wholesome and pure that was going on at the time too, which was the after effects of bubblegum. And the bubblegum was popular in both the United States and England, but bubblegum affected the music of England more than it did here. And for every one band like, say, Mott the Hoople or T-Rex that is huge and people know about, there might have been 25 bands that didn't make it, that were of that genre. And during that time, now see, this is the thing, glam is not as specific a thing as glitter, because glam was kind of a general catch-all for the general zeitgeist of the time. And it seemed like every band that wanted to make it would dress glam. There were all these pop bands that did...
Even ABBA, right?
Yeah, oh yeah, ABBA especially. When their first couple albums came out, they were ridiculously glam looking, but dropped it later. They dropped it pretty quickly after that. So a lot of very bubblegummy kind of songs kind of fall sort of in the middle.
Well, let's talk about The Sweet.
And now The Sweet, yes. The Sweet actually was a bubblegum band at first called The Sweet Shop. And then they did get, their first album was a split. It was half of, they split an album with another band who I forget, but they had kind of very sugary kind of songs that were reminiscent of ABBA, reminiscent of the Archies. As a matter of fact, they covered an Archies song called Get on the Line, I think that was. They had a song called Funny Funny, which sounded a lot like ABBA's Honey Honey. And it was a good song, though. They really made it their own, though. And as they progressed, they started to adopt more of that Mott the Hoople sauciness, and it became less innocent and a little more, saucy, a little more kind of mocking the teenage scene. And like there's that song, Teenage something, Teenage Riot, that's what it was called. Yeah. And, and so The Sweet kind of became a little more sardonic, and they evolved into more of what the real essence of what glam was about. Well,
is Fox on the Run, is that the ultimate?
I would say
is that so. The anthem?
I think so.
I would too.
Although Little Willie expresses a lot of that vibe too.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember when I saw Little Willie on American Bandstand, I about lost my mind. I was like, wow, wow! I knew I was only maybe 7 or 8 years old at the time. I knew that was something. That was a new thing that was happening.
Totally. Now, did glam flame out around 75, 76, or would you argue that it's always continued? Like, what would you say?
Yeah, well, the first wave of glam and glitter people kind of faded away, but a second wave took their place. That's when you came up with people like Kiss kind of came into their own. Queen absolutely came into their own.
Flamboyant.
Okay. Yeah, and powerful music. And that's when, it's about when Bohemian Rhapsody, which was considered such an outrageous song at the time, but a monster hit. I mean, it's a huge gamble that the band took.
Totally.
But it worked. And the video for it, the promo film is what it would have been known at the time, was brilliant. It was absolutely way ahead of its time. Okay, now Elton John, too, was another thing that he started coming to his own. Now, there's something I want to talk about with him and Slade, and that is that some of the fashion elements of glam, believe it or not, came from the suede head movement. And specifically, it was those boots. And those ridiculous boots with bright red leather and those thick heels. Well, Elton John, I think, was fascinated by that look. So a lot of times when Elton John would perform, he would wear a kind of a flamboyant, colorful version of that look. He would wear colored suspenders, colored braces, and have more colorful shirt on. And he had special boots made that were like huge, these monstrous boots. And people started wearing those. Those stack heel boots became very popular. And even ABBA shows them wearing them. Bowie, of course, picked up on that. And that's where, so it was it was this weird swirling thing of influences and trends fading out and coming back that a lot of Americans aren't aware of the full effect of what was going on in England. And Slade also used to kind of dress that way, even though they were not really a suede head band per se. But yeah, and then getting on to the later 60s and 70s, I'm sorry, the later 70s. Like 76, 75.
Well, the Dolls flamed out.
They did.
And
they did.
Some of them died, and they just completely burned out.
Yeah, well...
and then disco came in.
Yeah, you had disco and punk.
Right.
So really, those... Glam and glitter were huge influences on both of those movements. And later on, it would prove that glam was also a huge influence on heavy metal.
So hair rock.
Yeah, hair metal.
Metal.
We wouldn't have hair metal today.
No way.
So, that was the thing. But then you had some movies that were influenced by the glitter and the freakier part of glitter and glam, like Rocky Horror Picture Show and The Phantom of the Paradise, which really excuse me, I've got burpees today, really injected a lot of that vibe into that freaky vibe. So, and then of course, pop TV catches on with it. Sid and Marty Krofft, who I'm always a fan of, came out with they invented a band called Captain Cool and the Kongs that were like a glitter rock version of Fonzie. It was based on Fonzie from the Happy Days in the 50s. And stuff like that. But by 77, the glam bands that were going to make it would keep pumping stuff out. Kiss would keep pumping things out. Queen would, Bowie would, but Bowie...
He changed.
Yeah, see, Bowie wasn't glam to begin with. He only adopted the glam thing as much as he needed it. And then he kind of, after two or three albums that would be considered glam, he kind of abandoned it.
Sure.
He went on. He moved on.
Young Americans. He did different stuff.
Yeah, and that's an interesting thing.
Which is why we love Bowie. So.
Yeah. He stays fresh. He doesn't just rot away in some genre. And of course, Young Americans, as you may know, is the one where he collaborated with John Lennon.
Okay.
2 songs, Across the Universe, which is a John Lennon song, and John Lennon sings on Fame.
He's the high voice.
Yeah. And a lot of people
how many people don't know that.
A lot of people are shocked.
Fame is an incredible song.
Yes, it is. It's a true innovation.
Yeah, well, we're going to wind up because we're...
Okay.
But one last... Let's throw in a female real quick. Suzi Quatro.
Suzi Quatro. Yeah, she was an American that didn't make it here. She went over to England and became part of the glitter scene. And a lot of her music had that same dump-da-dump-da-dump-a beat. She's known for a song called Can the Can, which, nobody knows here,
No.
but that's huge in England.
She had a ballad here that was stumbling in.
She kind of sold out later. But hey, you got to pay the bills. But early Suzi Quatro was definitely a part of that scene. And so there you go.
All right. Thanks a lot. Take care.